So I was asked to talk about the technical aspects of infrastructure, but technique, for me, I look at it more at like how do you put infrastructure into place. I'm not looking so much at the individual infrastructures, about really how to get the process done. Yeah, and I think I'll just go on. We are here to talk about green cities. This is one. This is another one. They both have very different means of using their infrastructures or their political means to show that they would be green or less green. Master, obviously, the previous one, a prime example of what we currently consider as a green city, providing the latest, the dernier cri of sustainable infrastructures. The talk about green cities started with this, or can be pretty much summarized with this diagram, which I think most of you know. It's the target reduction curves of our CO2 emissions, which have been, by Peter Head from Arab director, summarized into this formula of the ecological age. A very mathematic approach, but it shows a bit the complexity of what it means to come to a city or an urban system that is ecological. So we have here, obviously, the CO2 impact. If you look at the CO2, it's a very complex makeup, complex calculation to assess that. It's the ecological footprint, which is the global hectares per capita. So we use too much earth. So this needs to be reduced from currently, I think, 5 global hectares per capita to 1.44. And overall, the human development increase. So while we have to work with this big reduction of our current life standards, or of our current consumption or output, we still have to actually, that is the idea, come to an increase of human development. So let's say that's the education, the happiness, the health that people would feel. So complex or diverse parameters in that green cities or ecological age perspective. Thinking about infrastructure, what is it actually? Infrastructure here, I looked at the dictionary. It has been defined as the basic underlying framework of features of a system or organization. So more precisely, it could be the facilities and systems serving a country or specifically a city, such as transportation, communication, and school, but also social infrastructure such as schools, or according to that dictionary, it's also the military installations. I don't think we are focusing on them so much in here. But looking at different ways, infrastructure can be physical, so the energy transport, telecommunications, but also the institutional infrastructure of a country. So how is a country, what are the norms, the processes, the regulations that actually govern how the physical infrastructure would actually work and how they interact with society. And as well, it is the personal infrastructure, which is the capacity of a population, for instance, to innovate, how educated they are, how healthy, how old they get, their skills, their health. And all this is somehow encompassed in infrastructure. And if you talk to insurance companies who know a big deal about infrastructure, because they mostly have to insure the risk when they don't function anymore, they look at infrastructure in terms of value. So it's real capital, which is with the physical infrastructure, but it's also all those immaterial capital which is embodied in education and health. So think about all those categories of an infrastructure. I'm coming back to cities and the challenges we currently face to rethink our existing infrastructures, which are mostly, which are the ones that led us to, consume too much of the resources we depend on, that are not efficient or not deemed efficient anymore, that have been mostly set up in the late 19th century under Victorian age and still function according to the same rules. We've seen Transolar talking about infrastructures that are much more ecological, that are much more intelligent, reactive to how people behave. So we know, and I also think that's probably, I just touched that very shortly, the current, the challenges that cities face are obviously all different across the world. You have cities in the south that might suffer from drought. I just looked at those that could apply to cities like Stockholm. I took that from a report from Arab on the challenges of Nordic cities, summarized in the problems of urban planning, transport, energy, urban infrastructure, water, and again, behavior. Most of the cities, unlike Masdar, well, Masdar is now also built, pretty much, but have already alive for a long time, let's say 100 and more years. So the challenge is also, I think the key challenge is to retrofit those existing structures with infrastructure, not putting everything new into place, but really trying to figure out what are the elements of the infrastructure we can still value, what are those that need to be replaced, what are the ones that need to be replaced first. And this diagram somehow shows a vision for, let's say, the most common approaches to which infrastructures we should tackle in current cities in order to get to that, target reduction. A bit more in detail, I overlaid them with the previous ones. The urban planning issues are about growing more compactly and efficiently. You know that here from Hammarby, that the compact town is a paradigm. The transport targets are, or the transport challenges to incentivize walking, cycling, and public transport, greening the vehicles, discourage private car use, improving public transport. If you don't use, every person that doesn't use their own car but uses public transport can actually reduce their carbon footprint by, I think, 83%. So that's a huge, there's a lot of carbon calculations in those seemingly simple headings, which I think most of you have probably seen, so I just summarize them quickly. Energy is obviously about local, innovative, low carbon, renewable energy resources, improving the efficiency of supply and distribution, and district energy networks. Cities are also looking very much here, I think all around you, and here Scandinavia, improving on the urban infrastructure such as street lighting, because there can be huge savings made on that. Water is crucial, the rainwater management here, to prevent overloading of the drainage systems and reduce the energy that you need to put into drainage systems to deal with the water. Cleaning and protecting natural water resources, reusing the water, and generally, on a behavioral side, acting sustainably must become more normal. And all of these things, all of these claims, which seem to be very common sense for any municipality currently that tries to green itself, need to be balanced out one against the other in their existing system context, because water is linked to energy and transport is linked to energy as well, need to be balanced out in an integrated planning approach. I will outline two of these approaches. The one is a bit the mainstream approach, which most of the engineering offices, including the office I used to work for, Arab, also Transolar, are using, which is a kind of very linear or maybe circular approach to trying to assess what's wrong and then implementing different strategies to improve the status quo. The other one is an approach that we are currently experimenting with in university, which is a bit more horizontal and a bit more open-ended, which I also find quite promising as a way to propose cities how to start transforming their infrastructures. So the one is, I call it a technical approach. The image here, who knows it? It's been shown almost as often, or no, not just as often as Masdar. It's Dongtang. It's the blueprint to eco-cities, even before Masdar was planned and built. The planning process pretty much relies on trying to understand, Dongtang is a town or a city that was planned in Shanghai, China, from scratch, similar to Masdar. And the planning process started with an assessment of all the requirements that the client wanted, trying to bring them together with an assessment of the site and the site capacity, what could the site actually deliver, and work with a very integrated team. You see here in that star, you see the different players that are involved in setting up this big, large-scale master plan. The process starts with setting all together this team. Once the team has been defined, and once the site and once the issues have been somehow defined, setting a vision, and very clearly from the beginning, the sustainability objectives for the site. Dongtang should have been carbon neutral, as it was planned. And with those objectives come the targets and performance indicators. So, well, that's CO2 neutrality, but also the idea of having, for instance, 50% reduction of car use, etc. So you can, the process of envisioning something which would be green and then trying to put that into numbers. And those numbers, you will reach them with very tangible strategies where all the different planners would start proving their skills and put their best practice together to say, well, this is how you could actually bring people off the road, this is how you could involve electric vehicles, etc., in that specific context. So we've seen, it's basically working with Transolar or Arab and using their skills for really coming up with good ideas. And then, as you've seen, you bring these things together and you would optimize them. So we would go in rounds, you would say, well, if we do that, that actually means also that we could, if we reduce energy here, maybe that also has an effect then, or if we reduce the car use here, it has an effect overall on the energy. Maybe then we don't need that power plant or whatever. And so in that circle, you would come to an optimized option for your ideal town. The principle, I think the cities that are being planned according to this, they often apply these biomimicry principles, so they try to, as I quickly said before, try to overcome a bit the inefficiency of the traditional systems, urban systems as we know them, that have been planned in Victorian times, huge tubes, everything a bit too over-dimensioned, by putting demand and supply into a smarter relation. Definitely also communication technologies are key to provide this intelligence, but basically a system, once it runs on information, which is the point number 9 here, can be much smarter in, for instance, using waste as a resource. If you know who's wasting what where, you can actually use it in a different place. You can gather and use energy much more efficiently if you have the knowledge about where things arise. And this biomimicry principles is basically the observation of how nature acts as a system, and no city so far acts in that way, or no human system acts according to those biological principles as, let's say, a beehive or so would work. So these are kind of, I think, underlying vision that many of the green or the ecosystems or ecosystem-like cities and infrastructures are trying to achieve. Out of these, general principles, you come up with fairly tangible or more tangible, less poetic, say, development goals. So you break them down into the disciplines of landscape or water, energy, natural resources. You create more valuable landscapes, etc. So each of the planner would have clear targets to work towards. And then you bring this together in a context to see what would an improvement or a deterioration on one side actually have for an effect on maybe another part of the system. So it's about finding a balance and finding virtuous cycles. You look at the scale of things, master plan, the block, building design, and you use best practice as you have it. And all of this is done in a very collaborative process all the time, involving workshops with both stakeholders, clients, and and you could pretty much sum up this entire approach in this diagram where you have interdependent elements of a system that are being collectively optimized. You change something here, and it has an effect on a couple of other of these knots of the system. It has been, this is just an example, of the analysis of the site, how you start actually looking into the site, how you look into how you connect the different disciplines together to a working team. This is a kind of example also from Jätkäsaari master plan, which was mentioned previously, but another entry, how over the long term, then you can see if those are carbon emissions, how you can over the long term plan to reduce them in different sectors like transport, housing, energy, etc. And then you plan also over the different scales, the regional scale, but also the more local scale. You would plan an overall reduction, and that brings you back to that target reduction of 80% we've seen in the first curve. So there's a question of scale, which you have to solve. So at which scale do you actually intervene? Here you see the kind of regional scale, the more urban scale, and then the very local building scale elements that would play together to reach such a kind of overall reduction. And you would look at other parts of the system, such as the food system and how that interlinks maybe with the energy system, the waste system, and even water, and how you could actually reuse and recycle within the system in order to reduce the overall energy consumption of the food system in this example. That also can come down to the building block, where you integrate food and energy measures directly within the facade. So these general objectives can become design parameters for the open space within a building. That is, you can put these things into context and then see how overall you actually compare to other developments of a similar scale. And you would look at how you would set up a social system around it, how these infrastructures that you put in place would be administered. Let's say if you change something to the food system or so, you need someone else than gardeners to look after it. You need kind of more people. Maybe if I stay with the example of the housing block, you need new tasks which probably weren't there before. So there's a governance scheme around that which needs to support those technical strategies with governance or surveillance. So I talked pretty much about systems design, and just to sum this up, it's a let's say top-down systems design that is led by experts in the field, and the principles of that is that you integrate processes, you want to be efficient with systems design, you set the objectives at an outset, so there's always a direction of where you want to go. There's an iterative process and incremental depth in how the strategies would actually follow each other, which, tries to make the master plan robust. The client is always at the core because you need someone who owns the project. And the project in general is a synthesis of different disciplines, different sectors, of which you can also test the performance, so they're all accountable to each other. So these are a bit the principles of this system design approach. I show you another approach now. Or the question is basically, how would you really apply this holistic systems design approach to a city that is already built? So it works very well for master, it works very well for individual buildings, it works very well for Dongtang, etc., etc. It works very well in a kind of bubble of actors that are well-defined and working together. But here, if something like this bubble would be the demand for a chaos which is already around, where you can't really say, well, there's so much wrong already to start with, will we be successful, basically, in implementing it that way? And I think you probably need a slightly more open-ended approach. So rather than having that clear direction and clear robustness, I think reality would demand a more playful, horizontal approach to regenerating cities, of which I now show an example here. This is a project in Nuremberg West. We're working with Technical University Munich on that. 8 different departments are involved and a group of students, which is actually key, I think about 100 students altogether of different departments and disciplines, which is a bit key to the success of the project because there's a lot of brain power and a lot of ideas mining, which we can bring to the project. So we call it an urban lab, urban laboratory. It's more the open process. It's not a kind of master plan. It's just a laboratory where you explore options for what could be done. And you explore them on a much more local and less holistic level, nevertheless possibly leading later to something which you can link together to a kind of bigger system. Challenges here, I think that was just the slide talking about the challenges in Nuremberg West. So the aims and strategies here are less about the ones I just shown you before, the robustness, etc., but it's strengthening of local identity, defining specific development paths for certain activities, make use of site-specific potentials which are already there, and maybe reduce those that are obstacles to development. As a team to that city, which is, well, Nuremberg West is basically an area in structural decline. So it had there were big industries in, like basically from the 50s, from the afterwar up to the 2000s, and they've all left within the past 10 years. So the area is very much changing, and so now we're asked to apply an interdisciplinary expertise in trying to put in future technologies and trying to secure a future for the site as a whole. And adapting it also to a future which is still unclear, because many places, let's say if you build Masdar, you have a very clear future in mind. If you build Dongtang, you know exactly what you want. You have also a client, and the client has a business plan. For most of the existing cities, you don't have it. Yeah? Like why would everybody invest into declining areas of a city? Nobody, you only invest in X. You can't invest in all of them. So that's already one of the key problems, that the future is a bit open-ended for many of those problematic sites. So one of the key questions here is like really trying to understand the local and global trends that shape the site, and integrating also possibly unpredicted things. And these unpredicted things very often, well, could be maybe more predictive if you would rely more on local knowledge. So the people who are already living there. Again, Maastricht and other cities, they are empty. And also people living there might have a different, not business case, but in terms of, we were speaking about value and infrastructure value before, they might have different things they value, which often are not taken into account in those big, flagship infrastructure projects which have, which are so clearly defined already from the outset that they have a client. So we started the project with a kind of trend assessment workshop where we looked at what are the issues at stake. And we did that with the local community and millions of students, and came up with a series of 10 big topics, out of which these 2 were somehow chosen as the most significant ones. One related to growth. So does the city really need to grow? Nuremberg, do we really need to create a new mass that attracts people or that attracts new businesses? Or can it somehow maybe become more sustainable in the way it already is? Which also means maybe with not so much investment coming in. And the other one is obviously the question, how green can they get? Because the people who were attending the workshop were keenly, they had kind of eco objectives. We put these 2 drivers, the growth versus non-growth, we didn't call it shrinking, but we called it stagnation, against each other, and then looked also at greenness, or let's say green economies, green spaces, versus kind of more normal urban development approaches, like that goes, we called that green space and density. Yeah, and that out of these 2 quadrants, out of these 2 axes, drivers, we found 4 quadrants. It's a kind of scenario planning model, and which we called what developers dream of. It's basically between growth and density, growth and business as usual urban development. And on the opposite, there is growth, but maybe not business as usual, but something that would be, using green technologies. So that mass production, for instance, would be here. Well, no, master would be. And then here we had exactly stagnation. What if you don't really have the money coming in, and and people have to rely much more on their own activities to reclaim spaces and to create value within the urban fabric, or create value within more the open space systems. Yeah, quickly maybe explained again. The Green Tech campus to the top left relies on innovation in green technologies. Natural resources would be expensive and used smartly. The local production would have a strong economic position in cities, and Nuremberg West would be an international pilot project for integrated urban and landscape planning. So the green open fields would actually be one of the key resources of the cities. Technopolis is basically the developer's dream, which relies on new industries, replacing the industries that have just moved, new population flowing in, Nuremberg becoming a new residential location desired, which would, there would be money for energetic refurbishment, there would be money for new builds, also demolition and replacement of structures, and new iconic buildings. Swiss Franconia is based, on stagnation and kind of reclaiming the value of the open and green space. So open and green space would be renaturalized. The green agenda would be applied to a small scale. So new biotopes would develop on the residual areas, the areas that have been currently left by the industries, and maybe for local or urban farming or other community users. There's a strong, or the development would rely on a strong civic engagement and self-built projects. And the last one is a bit what we know maybe from Berlin or other contemporary cities that, where there's a strong, let's say, creative industries involvement of reclaiming existing structure, but not necessarily making them more, not necessarily sharing too much the green agenda. So it would be the subcultures that we see transforming existing structures, temporary use and festivals, building collectives amongst local groups, and more civic activities. So these just as a way to open up the possibilities for a future. Yeah, there's not one single future that might be possible, but there might be different. Whatever you do within the time frame, from now to 2050, which would be, basically the renewal of, or not even the renewal of one infrastructure. I think 40 years is, normally infrastructures live for 80 years. So, but 40 years maybe would be the renewal period of badly built buildings, in a way. But definitely a time frame that is much longer than the current master plans or, the current planning ideas that underpin most of the business cases that lead to master plan activity currently. So you basically open up like a funnel of possibilities, and you can't really say with certitude what will happen until then. So we decided to set up the process that it becomes more of a toolbox. It's not a clear line that tells you this will happen and then that will happen and that will happen. But the approach is basically like a matrix where we look at the plausible futures. We look at, we call them fact sheets, like the realities of the site and possible measures that seem plausible, that seem useful to achieve goals, but they could potentially even be, they could exclude each other. Some of them might work in all of those futures, and some of them might only work in one or two of them. And then we actually tested that in microvisions, where we said, what does actually the site, what do the different areas of the site, what do they want if you develop them? So what are the kind of underlying logic of development that would possibly happen independent of a future that just the space would direct? And then with all of this, we get a toolbox of elements which the city can work with, and they can prioritize it in their own dialogues and put them together into a timeline as they want. We give them recommendations, what we think should be done definitely in the beginning. But it's a more open set of elements that can be aligned to each other. So this was the element of, we used the students, or the students were super busy exploring, different aspects of the site, and that were the areas, the strategic locations where we thought, for which we developed microvisions, because we thought in any case something needs to happen here. And that leads you up to this matrix, this toolbox, which we're currently still working on finalizing. Which, as I said, is set together from the general themes, and those, sustainability themes are obviously embedded in the general vision, but the fact sheets somehow show potential approaches, and the microvisions show potential desirable solutions for an area. So factsheets, yeah, are the catalog of the tools and measures for urban transformation. I just run through possibly some of them that, basically are based on the analysis of the cultural contexts, who's active, who's not active, who could be activized, what are the urban actors, what are the age groups, what are potentials of people who could actually actively help transforming the process of Nuremberg West. That's like trying to identify the potential of local engagement. That is an analysis on potential spatial development if you would assume that the part of the town gets much more self-reliant and actually starts closing their resource circles. So they wouldn't import and export as much food and energy and materials as they did before, but they would try to recycle much more locally. Virtuous cycles in terms of linking up the creative economies to the knowledge economies on-site and outside of a site. So we did some studies to that. We looked at the potentials of the existing urban infrastructures, reusing and connecting derelicts, rail lines, using them for open space or leisure uses. We looked at the potential of redeveloping public spaces in quarters so they would connect better to each other and connect people living in them, providing more meeting points for them. That is a clearly not in the growth scenario, an approach to figuring out how a very unactive street could be a bit revitalized. This is an approach of a huge, massive building, which is currently empty. It's by a German architect, Neufert, who also wrote the Neufert. It's handbook. I think it's got 20,000 square meters of surface, and currently nobody's in it because it was a warehouse, and they basically lost in the competition against Amazon and those big storage catalog warehouses. So the idea was to turn that building provide public spaces within the building while leaving certain of the spaces still empty, just securing them, but having the city somehow migrate into the derelict structures of the building and just assuming that other places would remain unused. That's, looking at the refurbishment of some of the public spaces in front of it, ideas of how to transform the landscape into urban agriculture, or which areas of the landscape would have potential for urban agriculture, the potential for water reuse in blocks, and we would look at the energy supply, where the supply comes from, and trying to localize that slightly more. Would look at strategies for optimizing the zero emissions scenario by also involving grey energy, let's say in water and other infrastructure systems. Analysis of the residential heat demand and how that could be improved by partial refurbishment of the building structure, but only very targeted refurbishment, and still looking at the overall picture, so you don't have to really refurbish all of the building stock, but just the worst, and still coming up to a significant improvement, and looking at life cycles at the time frame for the analysis. We also looked at system modeling and how these things then would hang together. But yeah, the way we started was much more incremental and on, really reacting on the locality and specific local opportunities rather than trying to make the overarching vision work. Yeah, and then these elements can be actually realized in the microvisions. And you can actually see how, by looking at one particular space, many of these, you can almost choose which of these measures that we put into the toolbox could be applied to a certain site and which ones couldn't. And those can then be visualized, and you can actually show them more spatially appealing. You can also really say what the, you can, from a spatial perspective, you can develop ideas for the refurbishment that would resonate with the municipality and the local people, basically. Yeah, so these were approaches of dealing with the existing massive building block, some new builds on the side. These microvisions would integrate some of the technical aspects that we have been talking about. So I think adding to the sustainable retrofit systems, as we talked about it before, with infrastructure, water, energy, mobility, etc., etc. There's a lot of other things that should or could, or well, definitely would help the planning of really sustainable cities. And with sustainable, I mean maybe more resilient, in the sense that they would, last over another 50 years and over another, set of scenarios that we can't actually define that easily. And those, like keeping in mind that there is possibility for radical change, that there's possibility for innovation that can be disruptive, that markets could, within that period of time, could transform, that new technologies could evolve. There's a much, much broader scope for somehow thinking creatively about the transformation of cities, and still talking about technical aspects of, of infrastructure. There is actually, I will finish with this image. This is it's called Neighborhood University. It's in Hamburg. And it's a place where both students, but also the municipality, would actually set up workshops with the local neighborhoods. Or not even workshops. Sometimes it's just courses for kids where they learn building tree houses, or they learn cooking or something. They're just being engaged. And there was recently a workshop on energy consumption, which was just randomly set up. And it's always incredible how these almost unplanned places that are spaces for opportunity, what power they have to really offset transformation, like real transformation in a neighborhood that is already existing. And I think it's important to just think of that. I think you talked about it yesterday anyway, the bottom-up perspective, and how that actually really needs to it naturally just touches the technical top-down problem of the infrastructure, because infrastructure needs to be run and used by people, so it's impossible to neglect them. And I think many of the unplanned elements can be used, can be somehow creatively brought into the planning process. Thank you very much.